You're listening to an encore presentation of ReelTalk, originally recorded and broadcast in early July 2025. From WKGC Public Media, this is ReelTalk, the place where you can join the cinematic conversations frame by frame each week. I'm your host, R.L. Terry. Today on ReelTalk, we are taking a trip to Tampa to the historic Tampa Theater, one of the nation's foremost examples of an atmospheric movie palace. When you walk into a 1920s movie palace, you are instantly transported to a different place, a different time, and I might add, this is the closest you can get to time traveling, particularly when you watch a silent picture accompanied by a cinema organ. Beyond silent and classic pictures, movie palaces also host new releases as well, often serving as a place where independent and high art pictures are screened, and outside of movies, movie palaces usually play host to educational programming as well. Today my guest is Jill Witecki, the Vice President of Marketing and Community Relations for the Tampa Theater. Welcome to the show, Jill.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for having me.
Great to have you on the show today. Jill and I go back several years because I was a recurring featured guest lecturer and Q&A host for special screenings at Tampa Theater during my time as a film professor at the University of Tampa, where I taught film studies and screenwriting for over 8 years. And even though I relocated to the Emerald Coast to run WKGC in fall 2024, I still make appearances at the historic movie palace, including hosting Psycho coming up in July. And as a quick aside, Tampa Theater is also featured in my book coming out this winter.
Which we can't wait to read, by the way.
Me too. I'll be glad to see it finally printed. It's been a labor of love, probably emphasis on labor, because it has been a lot of work. But it's
the love will come later.
It will. Getting to channel my love of cinema into a book seemed like a great way to continue a lot of what I've done in the classroom and through my blog and here at the station. So I appreciate your enthusiasm for the book, Jill.
Of course. And having you back for Psycho is going to be a real treat. I think that was one of the first films that brought us together in the first place.
I think it was. In fact, one might say we're going to have a killer time.
Oh, one might, but then one would get a groan about that.
With summer in full swing, listeners, some of you may be making trips to Central or West Central Florida for long weekends or taking vacations, so I thought you may want to consider taking a tour of or watching a movie at the beautiful historic Tampa Theater. For those that haven't ever been to Tampa Theater, Jill, describe for our listeners the history of your gorgeous theater, which turns 100 next year, I might add.
Yes, we are turning 100 years old on October 15th, 1926, which means that when we opened back in 1926, silent movies were the thing. Movies were a relatively new art form, and so movie palaces were a relatively new architectural style. And to paint that picture for your viewers or your listeners of kind of the difference between a movie palace and a movie theater. Movie theaters were around at the turn of the century too, and they were then, as they are now, kind of utilitarian spaces. You had a screen and some seats and, a room in which you could gather, but that was really it. Movie palaces, on the other hand, emerged as a product of the studio system. It was really Paramount and MGM and the big movie studios around that time that were putting the money into these movie palaces. And so whereas they were competing to create the biggest and best and most elaborate films, they were also competing to show them in the biggest and best and most elaborate movie palaces. So these buildings were intended to overwhelm the senses. When you walk in the front door, you are in the experience from the moment the moment you step up to that amazing lit up marquee outside. Mm-hmm. And so in Tampa Theater's case, we were a silent movie palace for the first several years of our existence. We were also a stop on the vaudeville circuit. So if you came to a film at Tampa Theater, you were also treated to some of those vaudeville performances, those live performers, as well as all of the newsreels and cartoon serials and everything else that was going on in between screenings of the movie. But important to note when you're talking about summer travel plans and coming to any part of Florida in the middle of summer, Tampa Theater was also the first commercially air-conditioned building in Tampa. We opened with air conditioning in 1926, and it was just one of the many technological advances at the time that made Tampa Theater a really desirable destination.
So there's so much to see, from the lobby to the mezzanine to the backstage areas. Vaudeville, you mentioned. I had a home there at Tampa Theater for a while. If you could, Jill, can you take our listeners on a tour of the theater? Like, what is some of what visitors to the theater are to expect upon taking a tour?
Well, to understand Tampa Theater, and specifically what you're going to see when you come to Tampa Theater, you really have to understand the man who built it. And that was an architect named John Everson. So at the turn of the century, and that's 1800s going into 1900s turn of the century, again, movie palaces were a relatively new architectural style. As movies were kind of evolving out of that storefront Nickelodeon, out of that, kind of curiosity into a more established art form. So, movies were coming into their own, the studio system was coming into its own, and they were hiring these architects to build these movie palaces. Now, a lot of the architects that were being hired to do that, their background, what led them into the movie palace business was because they had been building the other type of popular gathering space in those days, and that was the opera house. So if you think back to some of the grand opera houses of the late 1800s, early 1900s, and if you can't immediately call to mind your favorite opera house on a Wednesday afternoon, I'll forgive you for that. But they all shared some very similar architectural details. And in that, I mean, many of them had very ornately painted ceilings. They had great big, majestic crystal chandeliers, a lot of marble columns, a lot of heavy wood paneling, a lot of gold leaf in the accents, a lot of red velvet. that was very standard. So a lot of these buildings looked very similar to one another. And John Everson, in his work, was no exception. He came to this country in the late 1800s and settled in St. Louis and went to work for an architectural firm that was building those opera houses all up and down the eastern seaboard. But John Everson had an experience in 1904 that is actually kind of near and dear to my heart. He, like I said, settled in St. Louis, and he went to the St. Louis World's Fair. And I grew up in St. Louis, so this is something that we learned about in school, that one of the features of the St. Louis World's Fair was what they called the White City. And they did it again in Chicago during that World's Fair, where they built this entire village, this entire little miniature city out of plaster. And it was lit very dramatically. So it was a curiosity. It was a wonder to the people that were visiting the World's Fair. But in Everson's mind, it turned a switch for him. It clicked that idea that plaster and light could be combined in a very dramatic, very creative way. So as his architectural style continued to evolve, he eventually kind of made his way to Chicago. He set up shop for himself there, opened his own architectural firm. And that idea of plaster and light became instrumental in building and creating the style that you referenced earlier, the atmospheric movie palace. So instead of ornate ceilings, his atmospheric buildings had a very plain domed ceiling. And instead of the intricate paintwork, it was painted blue. Instead of the big crystal chandeliers, he filled those blue cove skies with little light bulbs that looked like stars. And then instead of all of that marble and heavy wood paneling and gold leaf. He molded everything in these buildings out of plaster. So as you look around Tampa Theater and any of his atmospheric movie palaces of the time, it mimics the look of being in an outdoor courtyard at night. So you see that night sky overhead, and then the walls are topped with what looks like the roof lines. Instead of getting big columns, you get what more look like architectural details on the outsides of buildings. Instead of getting any the normal ornamentation that you would see on the inside of a building, you instead have gargoyles ringing the ceiling, and you have replicas of famous statues tucked into coves in the walls. And then all of that is layered over with flowering vines and with trees and with exotic birds that are perched on the architecture, all to give that feeling that you're outside. So when you step into Tampa Theater, first of all, it feels like you're stepping outside, and you see that night sky overhead. In terms of the finishes of all of that plaster, John Eberson's intent was to make it seem like the building had always been there. So even on day one, when you stepped into the brand new opening night of Tampa Theater, he wanted the feel of the building to be very timeless, to feel like maybe it had been sitting there for 100 years already, and you were just now stumbling into this kind of magical, timeless space. We're very lucky that John Eberson was very verbose in talking about his theaters, in writing about his theaters, in frankly bragging about his theaters in the media and in works of writing at the time. So we have all of this information in John Eberson's own words about his influences, about his inspiration, and why he built these atmospherics like he did. And so with Tampa Theater in particular, he talks about wintering in Florida. John Eberson was a snowbird, and so he spent his winters in the Tampa Bay area and in Florida. And what struck him about this state, and again, we're talking about the early 1920s, one was the variety of influences that impacted the architecture here. So he interpreted what he was seeing as Mediterranean influence, as Spanish influence, as Italian influence. And keep in mind that your old stomping grounds at the University of Tampa, the beautiful Plant Hotel, Tampa Bay Hotel, what is now Plant Hall, would have already been there. And so he would have been seeing those things across the river as he was surveying the sites in downtown Tampa. So he took all of those different influences, a lot of European and Mediterranean influences. And then the other thing that he saw in Florida was a unique connection that the people had with nature. He felt that life here in Florida was equally lived inside and outside. Now, I don't know if that he was processing at the time that the reason that people had their windows open all the time was because it was so dang hot here that you needed that cross breeze. But he interpreted that relationship with nature as something that he wanted to incorporate into his theaters. So the color palette in Tampa Theater and in all of his atmospherics is very, very intentionally not red velvet. Instead, it is very rich browns. The seats in Tampa Theater are kind of a chocolate brown color. You don't get bright reds and bright colors like that, and you also don't get a lot of pastels. It's also, it's very deep jewel tones and darker reds and golds and dark greens. That again give you that, not only that feeling of being outdoors, but that kind of patina of age on everything in the building.
So when preparing for the show today, I was asking myself, is it Spanish revival, Italian revival? I had kind of ruled out Moorish revival, which is the Tampa Bay Hotel, which you described earlier. But I was left with, like, which one is it? But in hearing you describe it now, it's Mediterranean revival because it's Italian and it's Spanish and it's so many other influences that are all rolled up into one.
Exactly. But then layered on top of that is a heavy dose of John Everson's own imagination. So as you look at the details in the architecture, you know, this particular column may look very Spanish. This particular roof line may look very Mediterranean. But a lot of the ironwork, a lot of the railings really harken back to a more, medieval castle look to it, as do a lot of the tapestries. The tapestries in the building, which are some are original, some are replicas of what was there originally, are all based in the Lady and the Unicorn series, which was very British, European, and we have to credit that actually to John Everson's wife, Beatrice, who grew up in the UK and had a very particular eye for design and for style. So her job, according to the writings at the time, was as John Everson was designing his movie palaces, Beatrice was traveling back to her homelands in Europe and finding these beautiful tapestries, these beautiful furniture pieces and lamps to populate his theaters.
So there is
it was really a little bit of everything.
It is. It does have that whimsical quality when you walk in, as if it is the conjuring of the imagination of John Everson. And I love that it has this storybook quality. And so you walk in and you feel like you are immersed in a story. You're there to watch a story on screen, but you feel that you're instantly transported to being in a work of fantasy. Because in a work of fantasy, you do have all of these various influences, which you described earlier, and dating all the way back to some Renaissance and medieval influences. And so I love how upon walking in, the theater is a character in and of itself.
You hit the nail on the head. Everson talked at the time that, okay, so think about the films that were coming out in the 1920s. Not all of them, but certainly a lot of the films coming out at the time were adventure pictures. And they were transporting their audiences to exotic locations all over the globe. Now, really, they were all being shot on a soundstage somewhere or a backlot. But they were made to appear as though you were traveling to these exotic locations that the common everyday person in the 1920s was never going to get to see in real life. So they had the ability to transport people to other places. And John Everson talked a lot about, especially his atmospheric designs, as the extension of that he wanted that adventure to come down off the screen and to envelop the audience from the moment they walked through the door. So by the time they made it through this beautiful lobby, they made it through this ornate, incredible hallway, they passed all those birds and those trees and those statues, to sit down in their seat, they were already in that mindset that they were on an adventure. And so the image on the screen just became the next step of that adventure. In other words, when John Everson was designing buildings, he was really designing sets. These were set pieces to him. And so it really is a miracle that even though these set pieces that were built out of plaster, which is not the most reliable building material over time, 100 years later, it's still here.
Yeah. You're listening to Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC. Today we are talking about the historic Tampa Theater with Vice President of Marketing and Community Relations, Joe Witecki, and why you may want to add it to your next weekend or vacation in Tampa. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after a short break. On 90.7 WKGC Public Media, every day is powered by you. Your support plays a vital role in delivering programming along the Emerald Coast that educates, entertains, and informs. From news to music to special interest shows hosted by local voices, you'll find it all right here. Join our community of listener supporters today. Visit WKGC.org for more information.
Julia Perry was a remarkable 20th century American composer, but after her passing in 1979, her music was tied up in her estate with no one able to grant permission for its use. Until now, the exciting new arrangement to share Julia Perry's music with the world on the next Performance Today from 8 p.m.
Weekdays at 6 p.m. on WKGC.
You're listening to an encore presentation of Real Talk, originally broadcast in early July 2025. Welcome back to Real Talk. You are with Ryan R.L. Terry. Today we are talking about the historic Movie Palace Tampa Theater and why you may want to add it to your next weekend or vacation in the Tampa area. My guest today is Joe Witecki, Vice President of Marketing and Community Relations for the Tampa Theater. Jill, after someone takes a tour of the historic Movie Palace, they may be interested in seeing a movie at Tampa Theater during their visit. You often describe Tampa Theater as a time machine, which, admittedly, I did steal from you and the presentations you give before every movie that you host, specifically when it comes to silent picture offerings throughout the year. Could you describe for our listeners how Tampa Theater is one of few movie palaces left where they can not only watch silent movies, which, as we all know, weren't technically silent, but have music provided to them, accompanying the pictures with the mighty Wurlitzer cinema organ? Tell us more about that.
Absolutely. So you nailed it again. Silent movies, that's a term that we have ascribed to it in the present day. But these movies were never silent. You never walked into a theater and sat in uncomfortable silence watching things happen on the screen.
That'd be kind of awkward. It wouldn't be much fun.
Very. Every candy wrapper, every sneeze, you would hear it all. Here at Tampa Theater, when we opened in 1926, we opened with a 17-piece orchestra that sat in an orchestra pit in front of the screen and would accompany those films. Now, if you came on a Friday night, a Saturday night, an opening night of a big film, you would be treated to that entire orchestra. But incorporated into that orchestra was our mighty Wurlitzer theater organ. And so on a full orchestra day, that organ would be part of the orchestra. It would also provide some of the pre-film entertainment. So there had been periods in the theater's history where we had some quite famous organists that were employed by the theater that would provide, 15 or 20 minutes of music before the movie started or in between those vaudeville performances. Then if you came to Tampa Theater on, say, a Monday afternoon or a Wednesday afternoon like it is now, you might not get the whole orchestra because we didn't have a full house at that point. So on our Wurlitzer organ and on many of the Wurlitzers built around this time period, there's a brass plaque that labels it the unit orchestra. And what it meant by that is that you could have a singular musician who could imitate the sounds of an entire orchestra. So if you came on a slow day during a slow film time, you might only have a singular musician who was accompanying the entire film on that Wurlitzer organ. And that's one thing that made theater organs so vital during the time period is that they were one of the few instruments that could literally fill a room with sound. You could have one console down in the pit, you could have all your pipes behind the architecture, and you could fill a room with that sound. And Tampa Theater at 1,238 seats is a relatively small movie palace compared to some of the cavernous movie palaces that were built in Chicago and in New York and some of the bigger cities. And even in a hall as big as, for example, Radio City Music Hall, you could fill the room with sound from a pipe organ. So these pipe organs were common installations in movie theaters in the early teens and 20s. But very quickly, in fact, 1927 saw the first talkie. And here at Tampa Theater by 1929, we had gone fully into sound pictures. And a lot of these theater organs were pretty quickly torn out. They were using up space in theaters that didn't have the space to spare. And so in the late 20s into the 1930s, a lot of these organs were torn out. In some cases, they went to people's homes. In some cases, they went to churches. But by and large, they went into landfills. And so even over the decades, over the decades, as these theaters were reestablished, were brought back to life, they didn't always have that original equipment to work with. Here at Tampa Theater, we were incredibly lucky that it wasn't until the 1950s that the owners of the theater decided, maybe these talkies are here to stay. Maybe we don't really need this pipe organ anymore. And the 1950s were a rough patch for movie palaces in general. And there's a whole history of the cinema industry that relates to that. But basically, in the 1950s, these movie palaces had been kind of torn away from their parent companies, their parent studios. They had to make a profit on their own. They were struggling, many of them, to do that. And so the owners here at Tampa Theater saw the Wurlitzer as a commodity that they could sell, that they could make a little bit of money. So in the 1950s, our Wurlitzer was sold to Bayshore Baptist Church, which is just right up the road, a couple of miles from us. And it lived there for 30 years.
Wow.
And continued to perform at the church and work as the church's organ for 30 years. Well, come the 1980s, the church decided that they too were ready for an upgrade and were investing in an electric organ, which is a much smaller footprint, much less maintenance, so many reasons that an organization would choose to go in that direction. But by this point, there was a local group of organists called the Central Florida Theater Organ Society that decided to make it their mission to reacquire the Tampa Theater Wurlitzer and reinstall it in its original home. So after a 30-year field trip, the Wurlitzer came back to Tampa Theater. Now, it had grown. It had left us at about 1,200 pipes. It came back to us at about 1,600 pipes.
Oh, my goodness.
So it had gained some functionality while it was gone. And that also required, a bigger blower motor for the air pressure that it needed. We needed a different console that had enough buttons to control all of that. But this group was able to find a 1926 console that, that's all the keyboards, all the controls for the organ. And so once again, in the mid-'80s, the theater had its organ back. And ever since then, we have found ways to incorporate the organ into our programming, be it a pre-show concert, 15 or 20 minutes of music before a classic film, or, like you said, those silent films. So of the theaters of this generation that are lucky enough to have survived to present day, there are only about 40 of these pipe organs, 40, that still exist in their original homes. And Tampa Theater is lucky to be one of them. We are also lucky to have a partnership with a wonderfully talented man named Dr. Stephen Ball, who is one of the few people left in the country who still has the skill set to score and play a silent film. Because, of course, back in the 1920s, if you had a silent movie in your movie palace, the score came with it. Your organist and your orchestra were learning the music that came with the film. These days, the films may still exist in some cases, but the scores have by and large been lost. And so in order to play a silent film, first you have to have the music to do it. And that's something that Dr. Ball has brought to us, is his ability to write these scores and then perform them live in front of an audience. And so 3 to 4 times a year, we do still present silent films. And yes, you quoted my line that I've used so often, that if you've never seen a 1926 film in a 1926 movie palace, where every single note and sound effect is being performed on a 1926 organ, it truly is the closest thing to time travel that any of us are ever going to experience.
During its time away from Tampa Theater, to quote the Blues Brothers, I suppose one could say that it was on a mission from God. And
and that would get you a laugh, not a grunt. Good job.
So Tampa Theater boasts a wide variety of program offerings. Silent pictures representing only one of the many types of programs. You also feature retrospectives and other classic films. Tell us a little more about the assortment of classic films and Q&As and talkbacks offered throughout the year, and perhaps some that are coming up this summer.
Well, education is a huge part of our mission here at Tampa Theater, and part of that education is creating those conversations around the movies. You know, we always say that we want to do more than a movie. Anybody can show a movie. How can we make that experience even that much more special and memorable? And one way to do that is by bringing experts from the community, like yourself, like our other film professors, like our other film critics here in the Tampa Bay area, to come do those talkbacks after the film. So during the summer, our kind of tentpole series during the summer is called the Summer Classics. And this is our 34th year of doing the Summer Classics series at Tampa Theater. And over those decades, we have trained our audiences to know that at 3 o'clock Sunday afternoons, there is going to be a classic movie happening here at Tampa Theater. And our Summer Classics is really our broadest ranging, I guess, classic series here. And basically the only requirement to be a summer classic is it has to be a film that was a blockbuster in its time over the past 100 years. So our oldest films in the series date back to the 19-teens. Those are those silent films that we present at the end of the summer. But then it's going to be things like The Wizard of Oz, Casablanca, E.T., some of the other films in the series this year are things like Raiders of the Lost Ark, Top Gun, Psycho, of course, that you're going to be here for, Roman Holiday, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Some of these are films that are celebrating milestone anniversaries this year. Some of them may be films that were critical successes, won Oscars when they came out. Many of them have been recognized in the National Film Registry, but all of them were the hits of their time and are still reliable hits for us today. That, we know that if we put Casablanca on the screen, we're going to have 1,000 people that come to the building to see it. So Summer Classics is kind of our wrapping up the fiscal year. How can we get a sellout crowd in this auditorium every single Sunday afternoon? But not all of our classic series have that same mission. There are so many films out there that are beautiful films, worthy of being seen, worthy of being part of that conversation, that may not draw 1,000 people. They may not even draw 100 people. And so that's where some of our other classic series throughout the year really come into play. And one of the newest classic series just started this past January, actually. We call it Big Picture. And Big Picture is our opportunity to take that conversation about film to the next level. And so each month, Big Picture has a theme. And all of the films in the series for that month have the same theme. So, for example, this month's theme is Claiming History. And we're looking at films that not only retell a part of history or retell the story of a figure in history, but in their own way have shaped our memories of that figure. So it has blurred the lines between what we actually know about the real historic figure and what we think we know based on these popular films. So we started claiming history with Marie Antoinette, and coming up actually next Wednesday evening, is Amadeus, which many people have seen, and many people peg what they know about Mozart to that film, where we know that a lot of what was in that film was true or was based in truth, but a lot of it was wild speculation or just straight up fiction.
Yeah.
And then we end the month with The Passion of Joan of Arc. Again, a beautiful silent film that maybe isn't as well known as some of the others. But within a decade of it being made, was already being heralded as a classic, even back 70, 80 years ago. So putting these types of films together starts to create a narrative over the month that we can continue that conversation from week to week about how these films were created, how they make us feel, and what their place was in the history of the movie industry. So we've had a lot of fun with that series, and that happens on Wednesday evenings. So if a Sunday afternoon doesn't fit into the travel plans, but you're spending a few more nights with us here in Tampa, those Wednesday night big picture screenings are a little bit smaller of a crowd, and sometimes a little bit more academic of an experience.
Oh, what a fantastic idea. I love exploring that singular topic from a variety of perspectives, and that both more contemporary films and classic films are included. But not only are classic films the films that you can watch at Tampa Theater, there's many other films. I enjoy many of the classics, particularly classic horror films. But Tampa Theater also offers first-run, often indie films, and even stand-up comedy acts. We've got a couple of minutes here before our next break. So if you could, with that time, Jill, could you describe how you decide which first-run films you choose to bring in, and then some of what may turn you on to a particular comedy act?
Sure. Most of what we do actually is first-run films. Right now, we're showing The Phoenician Scheme, Wes Anderson's new film, in our larger historic auditorium, and then a film called Jane Austen Wrecked My Life. It's a fun little rom-com in our smaller screening room. And you mentioned earlier that some of those are those independent films, those art house films, a lot of foreign language films. We really try to find those films that maybe you can't see anywhere else. Maybe you can't get these at your local AMC. Although I will say the AMCs are starting to kind of delve more into that art house fare. But as an independent cinema, we do have that opportunity to look for those films that aren't the newest superhero film, that aren't the newest sequel, it's not the Fast and the Furious 47, although that was a fine film. But we really can find those films that make you think a little bit more and maybe make you feel a little bit smarter the next day at work when you're talking about having seen it the night before. And then you mentioned our stand-up comedy. Our beautiful, intimate little 1,200-seat venue has really become a favorite for stand-up comics and for small bands. So over the years, our stage has hosted notable names like David Byrne, like Harry Connick Jr., like Lily Tomlin, like B.B. King, some big names that are really creating that small, intimate venue to connect with their audiences.
You're listening to Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC. This hour, we are talking about the historic Tampa Theater with Vice President of Marketing and Community Relations, Jill Witecki, and why you may want to add it to your next weekend or vacation in Tampa. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after a short break.
The Smithsonian is coming to town. The Bay County History Museum needs your help for an upcoming exhibit that is all about food and the tools used to prepare it. We are seeking antique kitchen items to display in the collection. We'd also love to record the story behind your kitchen keepsake as part of the exhibit. If you have any old kitchen artifacts or any questions, contact us today. Visit our website at baycohistory.org for more information.
Consider how much easier it is for us to travel today than it was 50 years ago.
It's easy to forget just how little information there was for travelers.
Examine how tourism works today and hear how slow travel helped to reveal a curious tale of colonial greed in Africa.
They began to open up in a way that I would never be able to find in the libraries. Never.
On the next Travel with Rick Steves. Sunday afternoons at 2 on 90.7 FM, WKGC, Panama City.
You're listening to an encore presentation of Real Talk, originally recorded and broadcast in early July 2025. Welcome back to Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC. You are with Ryan R.L. Terry. Today we are talking about the historic Movie Palace Tampa Theater and why you may want to add it to your next weekend or vacation in the Tampa area. My guest today is Joe Witecki, Vice President of Marketing and Community Relations for the Tampa Theater. Before the break, Joe, we were talking about the different entertainment and arts offerings at Tampa Theater. But now I'd like to highlight how Tampa Theater continues to grow nearly 100 years later. You've recently expanded your footprint. Tell us a little more.
We are thrilled that over the past year, just about a year ago last week, we opened our first expansion in Tampa Theater history. So anybody listening that has ever worked in a historic building or maybe renovated a historic home knows the challenges that come with an historic building. Certainly the structure itself, but everything behind the walls, all of that plumbing and electrical work and HVAC that all likes to be a little bit tricky sometimes. So our biggest challenge over the years with Tampa Theater has been creating a modern theatrical experience inside an old shell. And making sure that when you walk in, it still looks like 1926, but the theater experience that you get is current and modern and comfortable for present-day audiences. One of the biggest challenges in that room is the plaster. So the thing that makes us so beautiful and so unique is an acoustic nightmare. When Tampa Theater was designed, we were designed for unamplified sound. You had a live orchestra sitting down there, and live music in that room just rolls through that night sky ceiling, and it's gorgeous. But when you're talking about amplified sound, when you're talking about speakers that are creating big, loud, rumbling movie sound, all of that plaster creates a million little microsurfaces for that sound to bounce off of. So we are in constant battle with the acoustics in that room of trying to focus the sound off the walls and into the seats. And when we have it pretty well calibrated, a movie like Oppenheimer comes along that the explosions are ear-splitting, the dialogue is all very low. And trying to balance that in a room that already has some acoustic challenges resulted in a lot of upset patrons that they couldn't quite hear the dialogue. And then when the director comes out publicly and says, well, yeah, I know the sound in that movie is difficult. I left it like that on purpose. You know what? Don't do us any favors.
No.
Because when a patron can't understand the dialogue, they're not blaming the director, they're blaming the theater. So we had the opportunity a year ago to open a brand new screening room. And it's adjacent to our historic auditorium. It's actually what used to be a flower shop. It's a little storefront that is right next to our box office that had been a tenant of Tampa Theaters for a long time. And recently we let them know that we were planning on doing something new with the space, and they found a new space up the road a little bit. And we were able to turn it into this little 43-seat screening room. Our main objective in designing this room was to pay close attention to the site and sound. We wanted perfect sight lines. We wanted perfect acoustics. And because we were building from scratch, we could make that happen. So when you walk into the Taylor screening room, it is obviously a very different scale, going from 1,200 seats to 43 seats. The aesthetic of the room feels very timeless. The direction that we gave to our architects was come up with what it would look like if John Eberson, our architect, built his own private screening room. What would that look like? And so it's very classic in its styling. It pulls a lot of influence from the original historic auditorium. It's the same seats, it's the same carpet, but with some modern day touches. But the acoustics in that room are perfect. And so very quickly, that room has become a favorite room for first-run film. Not that we won't show a first-run film in our historic auditorium. In fact, the Phoenician scheme is in the bigger auditorium. But that small little 43-seat room has become just this little darling of a room in cinema circles here in Tampa of people wanting that cozy, intimate experience with that perfect film projection and sound. So we opened the Taylor screening room June 1st of last year. And what it has allowed us to do in having that home for first-run film now has really opened up the historic auditorium to expand our other programming even further. So now we're able to do more of those retrospectives. We're able to do series like Big Picture on Wednesday nights. We're able to do more of those live shows. And frankly, a lot more rentals. This building is so beloved in Tampa that when people are thinking about where they want to hold their event, where they want to hold their graduation or their award ceremony or their wedding, Tampa Theater is high on that list. And having that smaller room to keep those first-run films on schedule is allowing us to do a lot more in that bigger room.
So other patrons may not be the only ones that you encounter at Tampa Theater, something about which I imagine many listeners may be curious when it comes to a historic building, particularly historic movie theaters and live theaters, is ghosts. So while for the most in-depth exploration of the paranormal at the theater, listeners may want to take advantage of a ghost tour. But in the few minutes we have here before our next break, could you tell us a story or two about some of the ghosts at Tampa Theater?
Well, Tampa Theater is regarded as one of the most haunted buildings in Tampa. And our ghost tours actually talk about 6 different entities that we know to inhabit the building. Probably the most famous of which is Fink Finley. Fink was a nickname. His real name is Foster. And Foster Finley was our projectionist in life from 1930 to 1965. And after he passed, his successor in the projection booth, and honestly every projectionist we've had since, has told us that Fink is still up there, that he is still running the booth to his liking, and that the rest of them are merely guests in Fink's space. And one of my favorite Fink stories was actually one that I witnessed personally. We have lots of stories over the years, but the one that I was there for, we had a film crew in the building. They were doing a documentary on Tampa Theater's ghosts. And by the way, it's called Ghosts Behind the Screen. I think it's still out there on Tubi if you want to look it up. But the group was in the building, and they had asked us to invite along a local paranormal investigative group. So we were investigating the building. The film crew was following it, and we had gone up to the projection booth to try to talk to Fink. We were using a piece of equipment called a REM pod that is basically a proximity sensor. It's got an antenna, it's got some lights, and you're waiting for those lights to light up and for the machine to beep, just like the backup sensor in your car. Well, as we're up in the booth, the REM pod started reacting. The beeping was happening, the lights were lighting up, nobody was standing near it, and we're asking it questions, and it seemed to be responding. And one of the investigators got very excited because she had brought the piece of equipment, and she kind of bursts out with, "Okay, Fink, if that's you, can you make the lights light up?" Mm-hmm. And she meant the lights on the REM pod. Mm-hmm. But what happened instead is that all of the overhead lights in the booth turned on at once.
Ooh,
and that actually takes 2 different light switches in 2 different parts of the room. Oh. So they all came on. The film crew got it all on camera. The paranormal investigators were delighted. And yours truly was like melting down the wall in the corner. The scariest experience I'd ever had in this building.
We are nearing the top of the hour, Jill, but I'd like to know if you can talk a little more about the importance of community. And if folks are here in the studio, they would see that I put air quotes around community, and how that sense of community can be lost when folks are more interested in watching movies on streaming services at home versus experiencing them at the cinema, whether that's your cinema or another more commercialized cinema. Could you talk to us a little bit more about that community aspect of the cinema experience?
Well, the ability to watch movies in our own homes, on our own devices, is relatively new in the context of the history of cinema. And if you look back at the roots of the movies, the golden age of movies were never intended to be a solitary experience. We were never meant to, sit and watch a movie on our phone with our earbuds in, to the exclusion of everything happening around us. And we're starting to see, thank goodness, directors in Hollywood and in other independent venues really talk about that and really talk about the importance of experiencing movies together as a community experience. And great example, we, at the beginning of the summer over Memorial Day weekend, we had the opportunity to show Jaws, which came out in 1975, so it's got a big anniversary this year as well. And we talked about that in the room. I asked for hands. How many of you have ever seen Jaws before? And most of the hands in the room went up. And I asked, how many have ever seen Jaws in a theater on the big screen? And very few hands in the room went up. So here's a movie that everybody's familiar with. Everybody kind of knows what's going to happen, but they've never had that communal experience. And I said, okay, there is a scene in this movie that is the quintessential example of why you go see movies in a room like this with 1,000 of your friends and family. Because when that moment happens, everybody in the room is going to scream, and then everybody in the room is going to laugh at the fact that everybody in the room screamed. And, I certainly don't want to ruin the 50-year-old movie for anybody that might be listening today, but when that head popped up underwater in that hole in the boat, the entire room screamed, the entire room laughed, and then they kept laughing because they all realized that that was the moment that I was talking about. You don't get that when you're watching a movie by yourself. And it doesn't have to be a horror movie. It doesn't have to be that jump scare. It can be that the riding off into the sunset. It can be that tear-jerking moment that everybody starts crying. And I'm delighted to see that there are all of these films that are really enjoying kind of a resurgence now. We just had a 20th anniversary run of Pride and Prejudice. And again, for the listeners that know that movie, the hand flex, that scene got that reaction from hundreds of people. Coming up in a couple of weeks, there's a 20th anniversary re-release of Brokeback Mountain. And experiencing that movie and the heart-wrenching themes in that movie as a community, in communion with all of these other people in the room, that's how those movies were meant to be seen. It's very different from all the social media videos, the TikTok videos of today that they're throwaway. You can watch that by yourself. But to appreciate the art form that is cinema, you have to experience it as a community. And for us here at Tampa Theater, when we talk about being a community-supported organization, that's everything. You know, we are a nonprofit organization. Yes, we make some money from tickets. Yes, we make some money from popcorn. But if it wasn't for our members and our donors and our corporate sponsors and truly the love and support of our community, one, the building never would have been rescued in 1976 when it was, and two, we wouldn't be able to open our doors 1,000 times a year like we do now, because you simply cannot make enough money off ticket sales and popcorn to support a grand historic building like this is.
No, a lot of what you just described, I feel, is echoed in one of the most beautiful international pictures that's ever been made, Cinema Paradiso from 1989-90, and so much of the film is about the community of cinema and how people come together. So listeners, if you've never seen Cinema Paradiso, it is an Italian picture. It's an award-winning film. It's absolutely beautiful. Watch the theatrical cut. Director's cut gets a little meandering, and so this is one case where I definitely agree with the theatrical cut of the film. But you may want to check it out because it's an image of what the cinema is in a community. I'm afraid we're coming up towards the end of the show today, Jill. Again, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Real Talk. It has been an absolute blast. I always love our conversations. Where can listeners find out more information about upcoming programs at the Tampa Theater, or a little bit more about the history as they potentially plan adding the Tampa Theater to their next weekend trip or vacation in the Tampa area?
Well, you can find our whole schedule of films, concerts, and events at tampatheater.org, and that's theater with an R-E.org. And I would also encourage listeners to check out Visit Tampa Bay's website, which will give all of our information plus all of the other amazing arts and cultural events and fun things to do in the Tampa Bay area.
And I will be seeing you here very soon, if not before then, on July 13th. Oh, 1 month from today. 1 month from Friday, on July 13th for Psycho. If you missed any of today's episode or to listen to past episodes of Real Talk or other shows on WKGC, we are on a podcatcher near you. Just search for WKGC Public Media on your podcast service of choice. Next week is Labor Day, and you will once again have the Cinema Speak podcast as your guest host. Host Brad has informed me that he and Trevor will be covering Dangerous Animals, released earlier this summer. Stay tuned for Jazz in a Minor Key with Walter Hale coming up next, followed by All Things Considered starting at 3 o'clock. Thanks to all of you for listening. I hope you'll tune in again next week, same time, same place, for more Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC.